Today, a judge denied bond to a mother and father accused of trying to starve their child to death. Investigators say the 10-year-old boy weighed just 36 pounds.
It's heartbreaking. I have tried many child abuse cases in my career, and this child was simply put being starved to death.
In 2023, at a small hospital in Griffin, Georgia, emergency doctors could not believe the number displayed on the digital scale. 36 pounds. A 10-year-old child weighing only as much as a preschooler. What shook the entire United States afterward was not simply that a child had been malnourished, but the question of who had allowed it to happen. When he was brought to the hospital, doctors confirmed that Evan's body bore many signs of prolonged starvation and abuse. On his arms and legs were bruises. He was in a state of severe malnutrition. Griffin police immediately began to verify his identity. They traced the address and discovered that Evan lived with his biological parents, Tyler and Krista Schindley, at 1705 Westminster Circle, just a few blocks from the Kroger supermarket. Within hours, those two names appeared in the initial case file, and that was the starting point of an investigation that shook the entire state of Georgia. The victim in this case was 10-year-old Evan Schindley. According to Griffin police records and the indictment released by the Spalding County District Attorney's Office, Evan was the biological son of Tyler and Krista Schindley. He lived in a home with 5 other siblings, ranging in age from 4 to 16. At school and in medical records, Evan had once been recorded as a normal child, with no serious health conditions. Reports from teachers and neighbors also did not indicate any unusual behavioral signs. What drew investigators' attention was this: Evan had not attended school for an extended period before he was found. In the records, this prolonged absence was explained by his parents with the reason of homeschooling. However, no official teaching documents had been submitted to the school. Evan became the center of the case not only because of his critical health condition, but also because of his very first statement to police. "I wasn't given food, I need food." That short sentence opened the entire direction of the investigation toward his parents, the very people who should have been responsible for protecting their child. One detail that especially drew the medical team's attention: Evan's stomach was nearly empty. The boy showed no signs of having eaten a proper meal for a long period of time. In his initial statement, Evan said that he was often locked in his room, not allowed to eat with the family, and had to find ways to store up any scraps of food he could get. According to his account, on the day he escaped, Evan's sole purpose was to reach the nearby Kroger supermarket to ask for food. This information was immediately forwarded to the authorities. Doctors concluded that if Evan had not been discovered in time, his condition could have led to sudden cardiac arrest within just a few days. The medical report became the foundation for prosecutors to request a search warrant for the house at 1705 Westminster Circle. An investigative team was mobilized that very night. On May 12th, the Griffin Police Department's investigative unit established a perimeter around the house, with top priority given to arresting the suspects and securing the scene. Every exit was guarded. However, when the first units approached, the house was empty. Krista and Tyler Schindley were not there. 4 other minors were confirmed to still be inside. The initial search results revealed a chilling contrast. Upstairs, the bedrooms of the 4 other children were arranged like those of any middle-class family in Griffin. Clean mattresses, neatly organized toys, brightly painted walls. But when they opened Evan's door, which bore signs of having been locked from the outside, the inside was nearly bare. No bed, no desk, no trace that this had ever been the living space of a 10-year-old child. Instead, only a few old blankets were laid out on the cold floor. The walls were stained, the window covered, so that almost no daylight entered. A musty, pungent smell filled the room, mixed with the unmistakable odor of prolonged neglect. In the adjoining bathroom, the hot water handle had been removed, leaving only a cold stream. There was no toilet paper, no soap. It was a dark, impoverished space. Not a living area, but unmistakably a cell. Investigators further noted that the house contained no medicine, no toothbrush, no personal health items for Evan, even though his dental condition at the time of hospitalization showed long-standing problems. This could not be explained as simple forgetfulness. It could only be understood as deliberate, a systematic pattern of neglect. How could something that lasted for years go unnoticed by the outside world? The other children in the home were also questioned one by one. Some testified they had seen their brother struck with the end of a belt. On one occasion, while the entire family ate together in the living room, Evan was forced to sit outside on the porch, cold wind hitting his face.
There was one incident that the children recounted that they threw a hot dog in the pool, and so he was fighting, drowning to try to get to that hot dog, and they all stood by the pool laughing at him.
In their innocent words, one thing became clear. These so-called disciplinary measures were not spontaneous acts, but staged as a form of entertainment. Turning a child's suffering into the family's amusement went far beyond any concept of raising a child. It bore the mark of dehumanization, treating Evan not as a family member, but as an object to be tormented. On paper, Tyler and Krista Schindley were known as a model Catholic family. They participated in many church activities and often appeared in the Griffin community. But when the records were reviewed, it was discovered that this family had previously had their foster license revoked and had received multiple warnings about their childcare practices. Teachers and school counselors had once noticed that the boy often brought to class empty lunch boxes containing only a few almonds or a couple of celery sticks. The signs of starvation were so clear that they had even sent letters recommending that the boy should not be left in the Schindleys' care. Yet somehow, all of those warnings were ignored. This was likely a major loophole in the oversight system. Allegations related to the Schindleys began to surface one after another. Some neighbors testified that the couple often went on vacations for days at a time, leaving the older children at home alone. They rarely saw Evan, and when they did, they thought he was only about 6 years old because his body was so small. The arrest of Krista and Tyler Schindley was carried out urgently. On the very afternoon Evan was discovered, police had already secured a temporary warrant. When the couple returned home, their car had barely stopped in the driveway before law enforcement lying in wait surrounded them. There was no resistance, no attempt to flee. They were handcuffed and taken directly to the Spalding County Jail. For the police, this was not a complicated investigation. There was no dangerous offender hiding somewhere outside. All the clues converged on one place, the house at 50 Valley Road. At the Spalding County Jail, Krista and Tyler Schindley were separated, each seated in their own room. Bright white lights, metal chairs, a simple table. In front of them sat an investigator from the Griffin Police Department, accompanied by a recording device. When the investigator asked directly, "How was Evan fed in your household?" Krista replied that the boy had issues from before, was a picky eater, and that she was overwhelmed caring for so many children at once. Her voice was flat, showing no emotion as she spoke about Evan's life-threatening condition. Tyler, in the next room, repeated the same story. Evan was difficult, often defiant, and they had applied disciplinary measures. He insisted he had never intended harm. The wording of both parents was almost identical, as if it were a script rehearsed beforehand. Even when asked why their son was left in a state of weighing only 36 pounds, he avoided the question, claiming he wasn't the one directly responsible for care.
There is a home, there are multiple businesses, and they gain quite a bit of financial benefit from fostering 5 children and then adopting them. So they have access to uncounted funds that would give them the ability to flee the jurisdiction.
Faced with a series of questions from investigators, both spun out various scenarios to excuse their wrongful actions. Yet neither of them once truly asked about Evan's condition. That absolute absence of concern became the clearest sign that Evan had not been seen by them as a family member. On June 30th, 2023, the grand jury formally indicted the Schindleys on a series of charges: first-degree child cruelty, aggravated assault, false imprisonment, family violence, and most notably, attempted murder. The prosecutor emphasized,
It is my true belief that had he not gotten out of the home, that this case would be a very different one.
From there, the case entered the trial phase, becoming the focus of public attention across the state of Georgia. Throughout 2023 and 2024, the pretrial process dragged on. By early 2025, the court date was set. Residents of Griffin flocked in, filling the courthouse. They wanted to see with their own eyes the couple who once portrayed the image of a devout family now faced justice. During preliminary hearings, the defense filed motions for bail, arguing that both had no prior violent criminal history and strong family ties. Not stopping there, defense attorneys also attempted to have certain medical photographs excluded, claiming they were overly emotional for the jury and could distort justice. But after much debate, the judge ruled to retain most of the evidence. The prosecution presented some of its most damning exhibits: photographs of the Schindleys' tidy suburban home, white walls, manicured lawn, neat fences. On the outside, this was a model family, but inside it was a prison. Then came the photos of the room where Evan had been confined. Windows nailed shut, an empty bed, extinguished light. Initially, through her lawyer, Krista claimed she only wanted a big family, but prosecutor Marie Broder cut through that. This was prolonged torture with the ultimate goal of letting the boy waste away and then living as if he had never existed. Records from the interrogation showed an almost absurd calm. They did not display the panic of parents who had just learned their child had nearly died, but rather the caution of people trying to manage damage. They answered questions methodically, their tone showing no significant emotional fluctuation. The truth was that from the very beginning, the couple had never wanted Evan. Krista and Tyler Schindley wanted a large family. Many children in the house. They focused on 2 sets of twins, particularly the girls, as the perfect pieces for the image of a happy family they wanted to construct. Evan was the extra. Evan's being rarely seen was not because the family was private. It was a deliberate tactic to allow a crime to continue undetected. By confining Evan and limiting his presence, the Schindleys turned the entire neighborhood into a blind spot. Neighbors could not report what they never saw. An invisible wall had been built to conceal a chamber of torment. In addition, there were many disputes over whether the other foster children would have to testify directly in court. The prosecution wanted their testimony presented, as it reflected the entire picture of abuse. The defense objected, arguing that forcing children to testify was too cruel. The debate dragged on for many months, becoming the biggest point of contention before the case entered 2025. On May 1st, Judge Benjamin Coker stepped into the courtroom and struck his gavel 3 times. He looked directly at the 2 defendants, his voice dropping low, but every word heavy as stone. "I have witnessed many terrible things in this courtroom, but I have never seen anyone treat a child the way you did. You stole his childhood, his health, and nearly his life." Before that, Tyler and Krista had maintained their not guilty pleas for nearly 2 years. But when the evidence was about to be made public, they chose to plead guilty in order to prevent the foster children from having to testify before the jury. This revealed that they knew the evidence was overwhelming, and that if the children testified directly in court, public outrage would multiply. By pleading guilty, they waived their right to trial, and the court could proceed immediately to sentencing. 40 years in prison, 20 years of probation, and a ban on contact with any minors. That was the final sentence handed down to the Schindley couple. At that moment, the entire courtroom erupted in tears. People embraced each other. Some clapped in despair, as a way to release the tension. The prosecutor walked out with red eyes, saying, "No one in this courtroom today could hold back their tears." In the end, Krista offered only a short apology to all the children, without a single concrete explanation for the injuries or the locked room. That very afternoon, major newspapers and local TV stations simultaneously released breaking news. Editorial columns highlighted the public's deep disappointment with the child welfare system. Some newspapers called the Schindley case a wake-up call for the entire United States.
A lot of paper for these investigators, a lot of work, a lot of interviews. In child abuse cases, we need pediatric records, we need school records, we need defects records, we need interviews with everybody that had any contact with this child, if there are other people that had contact with him.
Debates erupted across forums, demanding that Georgia state authorities clarify the role of DFCS. The largest demand was for sealed records to be opened, to uncover why such deadly mistakes had been made. Lawmakers and oversight committees were forced to question the effectiveness and procedures of DFCS. As of now, several months after the trial ended, little public information has been released about Evan's current situation, or where the remaining children are living, or whether they are receiving better care. The only thing everyone clearly understands is that the psychological scars will linger long-term. They must face wounds of betrayal, fear, and dehumanization. Not only Evan, but also his siblings will have to relearn how to trust adults, how to build healthy relationships, and how to confront horrific memories. And the biggest question remains, why were the warnings from teachers, from school counselors, from neighbors ignored? Why were foster care records sealed, leaving even prosecutors unable to access them? If the system had operated transparently and decisively, would Evan have had to live through starvation, confinement, and would his childhood have been different? Perhaps Evan only existed as a byproduct of the decision to adopt. It was this very compulsion that paved the way for the entire chain of abuse that followed. Not an accident, not a coincidence, but a script already written. This case is a reminder that justice is not found only in the sentence given to the guilty. Every warning sign, no matter how small, deserves to be heard. Because behind it, there may be an entire life, an entire childhood, waiting to be saved. That responsibility does not belong only to the courts or to child welfare agencies. It belongs to all of us. So, who do you believe should truly be held accountable? Share your thoughts and your own analysis in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next case file.